Landscape. I'm Michelle Flournoy. I'm the CEO of the Center for New American Security, and very pleased you could join us here today. We're also pleased to be able to co-host this event with the Center on Law and Security at NYU, and really want to thank NYU and Zach in particular for allowing us to use this venue. So the announcement of the Iran deal, as you all know, last week marked the end of a multi-year U.S.-led international effort aimed at preventing Iran's acquisition of nuclear weapons. This effort combined initial outreach sanctions, probably the most crippling sanctions ever put together in our history, coercive pressure, and ultimately very intensive diplomacy. After a year and a half of negotiations between the P5+1 and Iran, the parties announced a deal. And today we have an opportunity first to hear from John Wolfstall, an administration official, to better understand the deal in its details and some of the administration's thinking behind some of the provisions. And then in the panel discussions to consider more broadly the impacts of the deal on regional security and the economic landscape more broadly. As we speak right now, Secretary of Defense Ash Carter is actually in the region, first in Israel and then later visiting some of our partners in the Gulf, to talk about the deal and try to allay some of their concerns. One of the chief concerns that friends in the region have raised is the fact that once sanctions are lifted on Iran, Iran will have access to about $150 billion of assets. And many in the region and here worry that Iran might use at least some of that windfall to bolster parts, not only bolster parts of its ailing domestic economy, but also to fund destabilizing activities in the region. And so whether that's propping up the Assad regime in Syria, funding terrorist groups like Hezbollah and Hamas, or sending arms to the Houthi rebels in Yemen. So the question we want to consider today is what is our broader strategy to deal with these regional security concerns and reassure our partners as the deal goes forward. Similarly, as sanctions come off, the repercussions of Iran's re-entry into the global economy, its ability to once again put oil onto the international market, that raises uncertainties and opportunities as well. And there are lots of questions about the so-called snapback mechanism and how that will work, particularly in the event that Iran does not adhere to all of the provisions of the deal. So the question we want to consider in the second panel is really looking at these issues and how does the deal affect the broader economic landscape in the region and beyond. So today we have an opportunity to really grapple with these critical questions and hopefully elevate the public debate on these as the Congress begins to review and eventually debate this deal. We're going to structure our discussion around two panels. The first panel will be on the nuclear deal's regional impact, and that will be chaired by Alon Goldenberg, who heads our CNAS Middle East program. The second panel on the future of Iran's sanctions will be moderated by Zach Goldman, who's Executive Director of NYU's Center on Law and Security and also an adjunct senior fellow here at CNAS. But first, we're very pleased to welcome John Wolfstall, who is an old colleague and friend and is since 2014 has served as Senior Director for Arms Control and Nonproliferation in the National Security Council. Prior to that, John was Deputy Director of the James Martin Center for Nonproliferation Studies at the Middlebury Institute. Then from 2009 to 2012, when I worked most intensively with him, he was Special Advisor to the Vice President, Joe Biden, for nuclear security and nonproliferation issues, working on the full range of New START negotiations, North Korea issues, nuclear posture review, the whole gamut of nuclear and nonproliferation issues. Prior to that, he spent many years wearing different hats in the Department of Energy and also in the think tank world, including here in Washington at CSIS. So there's no one that we could have with us this morning to better explain the key elements of this deal and answer some of our questions about the provisions of the deal, but also its broader implications for security in the region. So with that, please join me in welcoming John Wolfstall.
Thanks, Michelle. Thank you very much, Michelle. Good morning, everybody. Michelle's very kind in not mentioning how long we've actually known each other. We started out at the same organization a long time ago. We were both sort of nuclear arms control geeks. Michelle has grown far beyond those limited confines. I couldn't find any other better thing to do, so I've just stayed with nuclear issues for a long time. And for the last 27 years in Washington, I've been working on nonproliferation arms control, verification, nuclear agreements. And so I'm very happy to talk with you today about why I believe and why the President believes that the P5+1 agreement that we've negotiated with Iran is not only in our interests, but by any standard is actually an extremely good nonproliferation agreement. We are proud of it. We think it's an outstanding accomplishment. And if you had told us coming out of either the interim agreement or the Lausanne framework that we would have been able to not only meet but exceed all of the parameters that we had laid out at Lausanne, I think you would have found a lot of skepticism inside the White House, as we have heard outside. But as you look at the agreement now, we can show exactly how we've been able to do exactly that. And what I'd like to do this morning is talk to you about why we think the deal is good, what it actually achieves, and to give you information straight from the source, as opposed to having to listen to a lot of the second and third hand interpretations, some of which are designed to be less than flattering for the agreement. And we can have a discussion, and I'm sure the Q&A will give us some opportunity, hopefully, to bat down some of the suggestions about what the agreement is, but actually is not. So as I said, we believe that this is an extremely good nonproliferation deal. We know that we have the capability to verify it with high confidence. We believe that it's structured in a way that will finally ensure that Iran complies with its nuclear nonproliferation obligations and will do what it sets out to do, which is to prevent Iran from becoming a nuclear weapon possessing state. There are things this agreement does not try to do, and therefore it does not do. It does not prevent Iran from funding terrorism. It does not prevent Iran from destabilizing the region. It doesn't prevent the common cold. But it didn't set out to do any of those things. What it's designed to do is structure a verification regime and a sanctions relief regime so that Iran no longer has the ability to sprint quickly to possessing a nuclear weapon. And that in itself is worth doing. There's still a lot of challenges that we recognize and continue to work on in other areas in terms of how we're going to deal with both Iran and the region. But for the deal itself, it does what we aim to do. And it does it not just for a short period of time, for 5 years or 10 years, but is actually structured to ensure Iran does not acquire nuclear weapons for a long, long time, and probably forever. There are some provisions in this agreement that expire after 10 years. There are some provisions that expire after 15 years. But there are also some that last 25 years and in perpetuity. And for me, some of the most important of those are the fact that Iran is required to implement the additional protocol, the gold standard for nuclear inspections, forever. That Iran is committed not only not to seek or possess or acquire nuclear weapons, but there's a detailed list of activities related to the weaponization of nuclear material that Iran is prohibited from pursuing or possessing forever. And those are spelled out explicitly in the agreement, as opposed to just some vague words that could lead to a debating society exercise with Iran. We've also made very clear that Iran doesn't get anything until it comes into full compliance with the nuclear terms of this agreement. There's no signing bonus. There's no thank you for a negotiating check. Iran has to do a lot of very difficult, very complex, very expensive things to shrink its nuclear capacity down to the limits of the additional of the P5+1 agreement before it gets a single dollar. And that means Iran finally has an incentive to do all these things that we've been pushing them to do, including satisfy the International Atomic Energy Agency's requests for access to people, places, and documents in order to complete its investigation into the past possible military dimensions of Iran's program. So all of these things that we've been pushing and negotiating over and worrying about for over a decade, in some cases longer than that, Iran has to do before it gets a single bit of sanctions relief. I also want to make clear, and some people make this argument that, well, aren't you letting Iran off the hook? right? Where's the punishment for having put us through all of this difficulty and for their violations? Iran's economy is rubble. They've been under the most crippling sanctions regime, as Michelle said, probably that's ever been imposed on another country, definitely over a country's nuclear program. They're not going to get that time back. They will get the money that they have earned through oil sales and other things that have been frozen, but they don't get compensation for all of the impact that's been done to their economy. By some calculations, there's somewhere short of $900 billion worth of investments they need in their infrastructure to bring it back up to a functioning level. They might get $100 billion out of the sanctions relief. I've heard the 150 number, but our Treasury Department believes it's closer to 100 billion. So they're still going to be far, far short of the impact that's been done to them. And from my point of view, that's a significant punishment, not only for Iran, but it's a significant deterrent to other states who might say, oh, well, look, Iran is going to be left with a very constrained, highly verified enrichment program. Maybe I should do that too. And our response is fine. If you want to go through 15 years of pain, sanctions, and the threat of destabilizing your own regime, but we don't think that's such a great path for you. So I reject the argument that somehow Iran is getting goodies and rewards for coming back into compliance. They've paid a significant price. So since I'm an advertised nuclear wonk, let me explain to you the nuclear wonk pieces of this agreement and why we think it's a good deal. We have talked about the 4 possible pathways for an Iranian nuclear weapon. These pathways, the use of the Natanz enrichment facility, the use of the Fordow enrichment facility, the use of the Iraq reactor that could have produced plutonium for weapons, and the possible covert pathway are all effectively blocked. Natanz will be under the most intrusive verification provisions that exist anywhere in the world: daily access, surveillance, constant surveillance by cameras, the right for regular, daily, and even special access if necessary. I've used the expression that if a mouse decides to move into Natanz, we will know about it. And so we believe effectively that capability will be blocked during the course of the agreement. The Fordow facility, not only will it not have uranium enrichment centrifuges, it will not be permitted to have any uranium in it. So just the detection of a uranium isotope will be grounds for claiming that Iran has violated the agreement and could lead to the reimposition of sanctions. And so the Fordow pathway is essentially blocked because there won't be any uranium, nuclear material, or uranium enrichment allowed there. The Iraq reactor, if there are any nuclear engineers or nuclear reactor engineers in the audience, let me know. What I'll explain very briefly is that while all reactors produce plutonium, some are very good at producing weapons-grade plutonium, the special isotope you need. The Iraq reactor, as it was designed, would have been very good at producing plutonium for weapons, could have produced 2 weapons worth of plutonium per year. Under the way it's being redesigned, the fact that its core is going to be ripped out and rendered inoperable, and the new core will be designed in such a way that it would take several years, perhaps as many as 4 years, for Iran doing special operations that are easily detected in the first several weeks to produce enough plutonium for 1 nuclear weapon. They would have to insert and remove 10 different cores of nuclear fuel for them to produce enough plutonium for the first weapon. At each one of those shutdown and reloads, the IEA would detect it, be able to go, and therefore Iran would be in verifiable violation of the agreement. So we believe that the Iraq pathway is effectively cut off. And this is, I think, extremely important because most people that I've worked with and talked with believe that the breakout scenario using declared facilities is really not one that we have to worry about. If there's one thing the International Atomic Energy Agency is really, really good at, it's monitoring existing declared nuclear facilities. What we have been particularly worried about is Iran repeating its past behavior of developing covert facilities, building a duplicate pathway to get the nuclear material it might need for a nuclear weapon. For 2 reasons, we believe that this agreement effectively blocks that pathway. One, what we haven't talked about yet, is that in addition to the nuclear facilities, Iran's whole fuel cycle, from uranium mines, where you get uranium out of the ground, to where it is processed and turned into oxide, hexafluoride, and a gas that can then be enriched, all of that is under monitoring by the International Atomic Energy Agency. They can't pull a rock out of the ground with us being able to find out about it. And if they do so, they are in violation of the agreement. So we have the ability to ensure that Iran doesn't duplicate their uranium fuel cycle through the inspection process. And in addition, Iran is prohibited from getting sources of uranium outside the country. They would need to import a lot of uranium ore. It's not something you can put in your briefcase. You actually have to ship it in by supertanker or by multiple airplane loads, and we're actually very good at interdicting Iranian behavior. We've been watching them very closely for a long time. And the ability of our intelligence community and of the IEA to detect those sort of activities goes up significantly under this agreement, because the IEA is going to be crawling all over that country. And our intelligence community will be watching to ensure the verifiability of this agreement in a way that gives us very high confidence that Iran will not be able to clandestinely build a duplicate set of facilities. And this is one of the great, I think, misfortunes of the debate we've been having so far with Congress. Even before we submitted all of the documents under the JCPOA to Congress on Sunday, the House Republicans introduced a resolution of disapproval. They hadn't even seen the intelligence community's assessment of their ability to verify this agreement and of their belief that this agreement can, in fact, effectively be monitored before they rejected it or attempted to reject it. And it's not the sort of debate that is based on facts. It's the debate that's based on politics or on rumor. And what we are really encouraging people in the Senate and the House to do is sit down, read the agreement, get briefings from our scientific community, from our technical community, including Secretary of Energy Ernie Moniz, who was instrumental in negotiating this agreement, and in hearing from the principals themselves, including Secretary Kerry, for why we believe this deal is in our interest. And we believe that the more we have that conversation, the more support for this agreement we will have. Just one more word about the longer-term basis of this agreement. There are things in this agreement that expire after a certain period of time. There's a lot of talk you will hear about Iran's ability to do advanced research and development on the next generation of centrifuges. And it's true. After 8.5 years under this agreement, they can begin to do some basic mechanical testing on centrifuges that they had been developing. After 10 years, they can begin to deploy a limited controlled number of some of their more advanced centrifuges, but in a way that gives us predictability. They have to declare their research and development plan to the International Atomic Energy Agency. That is a plan that will be binding, so that it gives us, again, some predictability about how the Iranian enrichment capability may grow over those years. But Iran is still limited to having only 300 kilograms of low-enriched uranium for 15 years. So those centrifuges may come into deployment, but they still don't have enough nuclear material to make a bomb. 300 kg is only enough for 1/4 of one nuclear weapon. And so that 15-year restriction is extremely important. The monitoring over Iran's enrichment goes on, as I said, in perpetuity. The monitoring over Iran's ability to mine and acquire the uranium it would need to feed into those centrifuges lasts for at least 25 years. So in the first 25 years of this agreement, we will know if Iran makes any attempt to increase their uranium capabilities and activities in a way that's inconsistent with our interpretation of the agreement and of their obligations under that agreement. And then this is the last point I'll make, because this is, as Michelle pointed out, and I know you'll talk about it later, the snapback provision and the way we will enforce this agreement. We've had non-proliferation agreements in the past. I worked for a month in North Korea implementing the agreed framework back in 1995, 1996. The agreed framework was 4 pages long. Did not have access to the type of intrusive verification provisions that the IEA will have in Iran. But in my mind, it demonstrates that we have learned the lessons of history from both the Iraq example and from North Korea example, that you need to have a highly intrusive inspection regime that has the ability to go needs to go any place that we believe that there is suspicious nuclear activity going on as soon as we need to get there. If Iran doesn't provide that access, if Iran violates this agreement, we don't have to go to the Russians and we don't have to go to the Chinese in order to reimpose the sanctions regime that's in place today. The way we've negotiated the snapback provisions, really a very clever, lawyerly approach to this, is any member of this agreement can go to the UN Security Council and introduce a resolution to continue the suspension of sanctions. And any veto-wielding member of the UN Security Council, including the United States, can then veto that resolution, and the sanctions will immediately go back into effect. Which means the United States has the unilateral ability to reimpose sanctions if Iran violates that deal. In North Korea, there was no self-enforcement mechanism. In the Non-Proliferation Treaty, there is no self-enforcement mechanism. You need to go to the Security Council. You need to get the international coalition to impose a penalty. We were unwilling to let go of that ability to reimpose sanctions, and under this agreement, not only did the Russians and Chinese accept it, but the Iranians accepted it too. And that gives us some confidence that Iran actually intends to abide by this agreement, but we have made sure that the verification provisions give us the capability to ensure that that is the case, and if they do not, to reimpose those sanctions and to go back to the status quo ante as needed. So with that, let me finish, and then I'm happy to take any questions that you have, and thank you for your attention.
John, thanks for that overview of the deal and some of the thinking behind the various provisions. I wanted to start with a point that you made about, the sunset clauses associated with various provisions, and I understand that, some of the provisions go on indefinitely, but there are critics of the deal who've said basically, even if Iran completely complies with the agreement, at the end of 15 years, when some of the key limitations come off, Iran will basically potentially be a nuclear threshold state. How do you respond to that concern? And are there other things we can do outside of the agreement to try to either prevent that eventuality or deal with it?
So, we've heard this concern a lot, and it's generally in the context that, if Iran has this ability to quickly develop nuclear weapons, that this will spark an arms race in the region, that the Saudis and others will have to match that capability. If that were true, we would have seen those countries rapidly developing nuclear capabilities today, because Iran is not constrained, had not been constrained, has 19,000 installed centrifuges, and yet what we see is not these countries saying we have to have nuclear weapons too. We see them working with us to figure out how we can confront Iranian behavior in the region that threatens them and threatens us and our allies. But I think there's a very basic realization here, which is the same that the last administration had, which is Iran has already crossed the threshold of knowledge of how to build a centrifuge, how to enrich uranium. And so to a certain extent, even if we had gotten an agreement which said you can't have any centrifuges for 15 years, you're not allowed to have any enriched uranium, that knowledge would still be there. And we would still have the concern that at some point Iran could quickly sprint to rebuild that capability to use it for military purposes. And so I think there's a recognition that what we have now is an ability to constrain their capability for a long time, and that even beyond that, we have the ability to watch their capability so that if they try to go towards a nuclear weapon, we still have a lot of time with which to respond, either using diplomatic and economic means, which have been effective in this case, or in the last resort to use any means at our disposal to fulfill the president's guidance, which is that Iran will not be permitted to have a nuclear weapon. So I think we have the ability, working with our allies, to ensure that they don't seek or feel the need to match Iran. And we believe that under the agreement, we have the ability to watch them in such a way that they won't be able to ever reach that end state.
Can you talk us through, if the Congress were to actually muster the votes to reject this with, a veto-proof majority, which I understand is unlikely, but if that were to occur, mm-hmm. and the deal were to fall apart, can you describe how you see that scenario unfolding for Iran, for the United States, for the region?
Sure. Well, I can, but I think also, the President and Secretary Kerry have been laying this argument out very effectively. Let's go through the logic here. And also let's keep in mind, this would be true whether the UN Security Council had acted yesterday or not, right? The Security Council resolution doesn't remove Congress's ability to vote against this deal and to block it. In the simplest terms, we get the worst of both worlds. The rest of the world essentially would be free to implement this agreement with Iran. The UN Security Council resolutions and the sanctions would come off. The sanctions that have crippled Iran's economy would come off, and Iran would not be required to meet any of the nuclear restrictions that are contained in this agreement. So they would have enrichment, and they would have sanctions relief at the same time. And as Secretary Kerry said this morning, not only would that be the case, but if we then try to go back to the international community and say, no, we need sanctions to constrain their nuclear capabilities, or we need UN Security Council backing to take military action, what are the odds of the United States, having brought the entire world to the negotiating table and having signed this deal and then rejected it, would be able to muster that sort of international leadership? It's just, as the Secretary said, it's just impossible to imagine. And so while Congress does have the ability to block this agreement, we think that that outcome is so disastrous that saner minds will prevail in the Congress. And we hope, and recognize that hope isn't always a strategy, that the engagement with the Congress and the details of this agreement will show reasonable skeptics that in fact it does what it says it can do, and therefore that it is in the interest of the Congress to support it.
Okay. I wanted to walk through a couple of the specific provisions that have come under fire and ask to draw you out a little bit on the administration's thinking behind them. So let's start with inspections and monitoring. The question is whether the inspections are really sufficient to catch any cheating that Iran might undertake. Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu, as many of you have read, has come out publicly and said, look, if the system will basically take 24 days to get from raising a concern to actually getting on site to look at an activity, and in that time Iran could clean up or hide anything that it was doing to cheat. And another criticism that's been raised is the IAEA, particularly given the Iranians' restrictions on who can be on IAEA teams. I think they're saying it has to be someone who already has countries that have diplomatic relations with Iran. Does the IAEA actually have the skills and capacity to implement this regime fully and successfully and so forth? Can you speak to those criticisms of the inspections regime and tell us how you would respond? Sure.
You're much more diplomatic than I am. What Prime Minister Netanyahu said was, it's like a meth dealer. They could just flush the stuff down the toilet. And what I said is that's going to be one radioactive toilet, and you are not going to want to use it. I'll give you an example. So Dr. Olli Heinonen, who was the head of the safeguards program at the IAEA, has laid out a scenario which he says shows that the 24-day period, which is the longest it could take to get access. It could also take as little as 24 hours. So there's a provision for the agreement. And by the way, it's important, the way this agreement is structured, if the IAEA requests access and Iran refuses, the votes of the United States, the UK, France, Germany, and the EU can back that request, and Russia and China and Iran cannot block the access. So in 24 days, Iran would be legally required to provide that access in the extremis, and if it didn't, it would be in clear violation of the JCPOA. But we believe it could actually take place in much less time. So the example that Dr. Heinonen laid out was, well, let's assume you're at the very end of the weaponization process, and you were going to turn uranium metal in a furnace into the shapes needed. So you would take highly enriched uranium, you would convert it to oxide, you then convert it to fluoride, you then convert it to metal, and then you would be able to put it in this furnace. And that furnace chamber could operate in a room that you might be able to sanitize within 24 days. Well, Iran's not allowed to have highly enriched uranium. We detect that within hours of their attempt to produce it. They're not allowed to remove it from a safeguarded facility ever. We would detect that within probably hours, if not days. They're not allowed to reconvert to oxide or to fluoride or to metal, and all of those things are things we could detect. So what he's basically saying is they would have to go through years of effort, multiple steps, recreate an entire process that we know we have high confidence that we could detect before they could get to that room which they could clean up in 24 hours. And so we just don't view those scenarios as credible, and this is not just my poor chemistry and physics experience coming to bear here. These are the leading safeguards experts, the leading engineering experts in the world who've come up with this program and that the IC believes is going to be effective. So we think the 24-day period it's possible there are small things that Iran might be able to hide. Can you prevent a guy with a pad of paper from developing what a bomb might look like on a pad? But that's not what it takes to build nuclear weapons. You need a whole infrastructure. And I'm sorry, the second part of your question got to...
Was the IAEA capacity.
Right, the IAEA. So there are two answers to this. The short answer is, look, the IAEA is the group that got it right in Iraq when we got it wrong. These are people that knew that the allegation that Iraq was trying to get uranium from Africa, that those documents were a forgery. They figured it out in 36 hours. We spent months backing them. So the IAEA is the only organization that has a proven track record for doing this work. But we also have been working with the IAEA not only for decades and decades to build up their technical capability, but for several years to help them develop the technologies, to have the resources and the personnel that they're going to need to do this job. It is going to be relatively expensive for the IAEA. Could take several $1 million additional effort over the first several years. They need to install specialized modern equipment, which is explicitly allowed in the agreement. But we have very high confidence that the IAEA is not only up to this task, but that they've got a demonstrated capability that gives them the right role in the center of this agreement.
Another aspect of the agreement that's been, sort of highlighted is the provisions related to research and development. This is one of the hardest things to monitor and really understand in detail. My understanding is that as of year 8, certain limitations on research and development start to be lifted or relaxed. And there's some concern that, again, around year 15, Iran's breakout time could be close to 0. So the question is, how do you see, are the limitations on R&D adequate? How do they play with regard to breakout time? And again, it kind of gets back to this question of, how do we deal with the fact that Iran could end up very close to a threshold, even if it's fully in compliance with the agreement by the end of its terms?
So we would have very much liked an agreement that says Iran can have no centrifuges at all. We tried that when they had 164 centrifuges back in the Bush administration. They said no. We then launched into a tremendous pressure program. They went up to 19,000 centrifuges. So it's pretty clear to us over the last decade that Iran is going to insist, no matter what, on some capability to produce enriched uranium. We believe that we've negotiated an agreement that can do that without the threat of Iran having the ability to produce a nuclear weapon. But over time, Iran will have the right to increase its capacity in a way that is declared, in a way that is very strictly monitored, and so that as the time it would take them to produce enough nuclear material for a weapon is smaller and smaller, our inspection regime would continue unabated, and we'd have the ability to monitor that. Is that a perfect world? Absolutely not. We would have much preferred one where they didn't have any centrifuges, but this is a negotiation, and we had to find some middle ground. What we have is some clear statements by Iran that they must meet, that those increases will be declared and that will be under inspection, that they will be consistent with a peaceful nuclear program, and that even as the breakout time reduces, that they are still restricted from doing anything in the weaponization area, that they're still restricted from doing things in the research and development area that would help them turn that material into a nuclear weapon. There are also, quite frankly, the right inherent in the part of any sovereign state to say, we signed this agreement, we implemented it, Iran is now behaving in a way that's inconsistent with its peaceful commitments. It's producing HEU even though it doesn't have a use for it. It's stockpiling large amounts of HEU and is doing it in a form that's inconsistent with its nuclear program. At any point at that stage, the United States could say to its friends and allies, look, we don't think Iran is abiding by its agreement anymore. We think they're too close, and we need to make sure that they remain incentivized to stay on the right side of the line. And so we always have recourse in the future, whether that's 10, 20, 30, 40 years, to take action to ensure that Iran doesn't acquire a nuclear weapon, because they will be bound by the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. They will have the JCPOA additional restrictions on weaponization that if they violate, we still possess our rights to confront them on.
So let's talk about, one of the instruments that's been talked about in, confronting Iran with any kind of cheating or violation is the snapback sanctions provision. I have a couple of questions. The first is, the agreement sets out this very detailed timeline, including this notion of implementation day, which is the point at which Iran will have taken several verifiable steps to comply with the nuclear dimension of the agreement, and then implementation day is when the sanctions will be lifted. First of all, what's the sort of expected timeline for that? Is it 3 months, 6 months, 9 months? What do we think? What kind of timeline are we looking
This
at?
is the next over-under, right? You know, it's
Yeah.
like how many extensions will we have on the negotiation was the last game. We don't know because we actually have to do relatively few things to get ourselves into a position to implement. Iran has to do a lot of things. And it really, as Iran asked us, well, you know, how quickly can you lift the sanction? And we said, well, it depends. How quickly can you rip your centrifuges out of Fordo and put them under storage? How quickly can you implement your agreement with the International Atomic Energy Agency for access to Parchin, for access to the experts that they've requested? So the rough estimate is that it might take 6 months. Iran has some technical challenges, particularly as it comes to eliminating their stocks of uranium. They're going to have to convert a lot of that. They're going to have to sell some of it. They're going to have to do some work on the reactor. So if they really are incentivized, and we think they are, it could take 6 months, but it could take longer. I don't think there's any expectation that it's going to happen in a couple of months because there's a lot of work to do.
Okay. The other question about snapback is more to do with political will, both in the sense that over time, how do you sustain the political will to, to enforce the agreement? And secondly, the question of, if Iran were, rather than cheating sort of in a major way, and, if they were to sort of death by 1,000 cuts, little things on the margins that might slowly help them creep into a different position, but each one by itself would not seem to be enough to trigger snapback. I mean, how do you address those concerns?
Sure, and I think this is another case where we really have worked to learn the lessons of history because we saw our mechanism in Iraq after 1991 and after leading up to 2003 was, well, is that really going back to war over, right? They didn't let the inspectors into a nuclear palace for a week, but are really going to redeploy 100,000 troops to Saudi Arabia and go back to war. We have the ability under this agreement to reimpose the full suite of sanctions through the UN Security Council snapback, but we also have the ability to work with the EU or to reimpose unilateral sanctions in a domestic sense, because the president has a lot of waiver authority on different acts that he could exercise in response to Iranian non-compliance or what we call implementation ambiguities. And there's a legal standard here that basically talks about proportionality and do you have a just cause? Are they a material breach or are they simply violating technical provisions of the agreement? So we do have tools other than the big sledgehammer of snapback. I'm sorry, I forgot the first part of your question, Michelle.
So when was the timing, and then you answered it, and then what if the less than egregious violations occur?
Oh no, it was the political will, and
Political will,
this
yes,
is
thank you.
so this is where having been around for a little while, you and I sort of remember we started working to try and head off Iran's nuclear efforts when Ronald Reagan was president, right? We were concerned that the Soviets were going to take over the Bushehr nuclear reactor project that the West Germans had abandoned back in the 70s. The Bush administration really began to work with Russia and try to cut off some of the nuclear cooperation that was going on with Iran because we were concerned about their activities. Everybody said we were crazy, right? You're still upset over the hostages and you're out to get the Iranian regime because you don't like them. And it turns out we were able to sustain that effort and increase the sanctions over 20 plus years. Preventing Iran from having a nuclear weapon is not one president's issue, right? It's been a national commitment for almost a generation now. And I think that any president is going to have the same goal in mind, which that a nuclear Iran is so destabilizing to our friends and allies in the region and so threatening to us that the implementation of this agreement is critical. Now, if in 30 years there's a better way to prevent Iran from having a nuclear weapon, then I think the president, he or she at that time, could decide what that path might be. But for now, not only is this the best thing and the best way to do it, but it's really the only effective way to do it.
Yeah. So I'd like to open up the questions to the audience now. When I call on you, please stand up. I think we have some microphones around in the aisles, and please state your name, your affiliation, and ask a question. Don't give a speech. So any questions from the audience? Yes, sir, right here.
Ken Meyer, Cord, World Docs. Didn't the Iranians begin their enrichment program because we denied them the opportunity to buy enriched uranium on the open market? And if they had been able to do that, wouldn't it have been easy to verify how much enriched uranium they were purchasing and of what type? In fact, might we not today be in that situation of a perfect world, as you describe it, where Iran doesn't have any centrifuges? So in retrospect, was the refusal to allow Iran to buy enriched uranium openly a mistake?
Hindsight's always 20/20. I think you could make the argument that we should have allowed Iran to buy into Eurodiff, which was an effort they tried to buy 10% of back in the 1980s. But it wasn't those activities that led Iran to have a nuclear weapons program. We know that Iran was seeking nuclear weapons prior to 2003, and that wasn't because they couldn't buy uranium on the open market for the Tehran research reactor. So there are things in hindsight we could have done. I would argue most effectively we should have taken the deal in the early 2000s when Iran said, let us keep our 164 centrifuges and not feed any uranium into them. That would have been a great deal. But I can't go back and reset the clock.
You should tell our intelligence agencies that Iran has a nuclear weapons program because they haven't gotten the word.
Actually, the declassified NIE says that they stopped their nuclear weapons program in 2003.
Okay, other questions? Yes, right here, down here in the front.
Thank you. Jonas Paul-Pistner with the Embassy of Denmark, heading the Foreign Policy Department. I was going to ask you about Congress a little bit more. I mean, the president the other day in the press conference was saying that he was hoping, when laying out the facts, a majority in Congress would support that. Then he sort of stopped himself and said, but this is Washington. And so I was going to ask you a little bit more about what sort of facts you see that actually sort of convince in Congress among the people that haven't already signed up to a resolution of disapproval.
Yeah.
And second would be a nuclear technical question about the managed access. There's both sort of additional protocol and then the stipulations on managed access. Which do you see as sort of most sort of useful in enforcing? Because actually the additional protocol has also quite quick sort of access, but doesn't have the sort of snapback options that the agreement has.
When you join the government, there's a indoctrination program, there's a orientation program. They need to add a line which is never correct the president. So I think the president is right here, which is look, we would love a majority to support this agreement, but we recognize that the political environment in this Congress would not get majority approval for anything the president does, right? This is a Congress that rejected the Disabilities Treaty. What we are focused on is trying to get reasonable people to look at the details of the agreement, reasonable people that understand the agreement in Congress to talk to their colleagues who sometimes defer to other members of the Senate and the House. There are members of the Senate who are physicists, and they tend to sort of have a proxy, not quite a proxy, but they definitely tend to be sort of touchstones for other senators and congressmen. So we hope that we will get a sufficient number of people to support the agreement, but obviously tactically what we're looking at is are there enough to show that the president can sustain a veto so that we don't have to go to that situation. In terms of the provisions of the additional protocol and otherwise, we could have just said, look, implement the additional protocol, but we knew that that wasn't sufficient. Because under the additional protocol, a state is required to provide access, in some cases as few as 2 hours or 24 hours, but then has the right to refuse. And there's no clear dispute resolution mechanism. What we negotiated was sort of on top of the additional protocol, these provisions that make sure the IEA's right will be backed up, and that if it's not backed up and Iran refuses, that they will be punished. That is the deterrent. That is the incentive to make sure that Iran doesn't repeat this game, because we've seen this in the past, right? And we have this as well in arms control agreements, right? We negotiate with the Russians, and we say, well, you can only have this number of weapons, you can only have that number of weapons, let's do it for 10 years, right? I look back, this will warm your cockles of your heart. SALT was a 5-year agreement, right? This is when we were trying to kill each other with the Soviet Union. 5 years was sufficient transparency to sort of lock in an agreement. We know we needed more than the additional protocol, and that's why we think the details of this agreement really satisfy our concerns.
Yeah. Okay. Yes.
Thank you. Steve Shahida, I'm here in my personal capacity. First of all, thank you very much for giving peace and diplomacy a chance. I have both my parents and many friends and family living there. My question is, there's so much emphasis on cheating and punishment, including here today. although it might be obvious, can you speak to Iran's incentives for full and continued compliance?
Well, look, we recognized for a long, long time that shockingly there's politics in Iran too. We decided a long time ago we're not going to pick sides. We may think that one group is better than another, one leader is easier to work with than another, but the Iranian people and the Iranian state have to decide what they want to do here. They have a legal commitment in the Non-Proliferation Treaty that they voluntarily signed up to never to possess nuclear weapons. The IAEA has found that they were in violation of their safeguards agreements by conducting activities outside the frame. So the Bush administration had said, as we have said, that if Iran can reassure the international community about their peaceful intentions of their nuclear program, if they can come back into compliance and demonstrate their fealty to that obligation, that they could resume the activities of a normal nuclear state. Doesn't mean we're not going to have challenges with them because they are engaging activities that threaten us and our allies. But the incentive is, as Iran has said, is we want to be treated like everybody else. We want to be able to do international commerce, to sell oil on the open market, to have our children study abroad, to do trade and engage with the rest of the outside world. That's a very powerful incentive for a very proud country. And a country that has been isolated because of their nuclear activities predominantly for now over a generation. We think that could bring other benefits. It may also cause other problems for us, and we're prepared to deal with them as they come. But one thing we recognize is that we benefit if Iran doesn't have nuclear weapons. And Iran has said that they will benefit if they are released from the nuclear-driven sanctions. And from our point of view, that seems like a reasonable bargain if both sides can work together to verify their implementation.
Okay. I think we have time for one last question. Sir, back in the middle there. Raise your hand. Yep.
I'm Staff Lieutenant Colonel Ahmed, the Deputy of Egyptian Defense Attaché. The Secretary Carter was in the region and have visiting to different countries. My question is there is any military procedures parallel with the political one? Second question, what's your assessment for the security arrangement in the region after the deal? Thank you.
Whether we'd had a completed agreement or not, we would have continued with our very close defense consultations in the region. We believe, if anything, the provisions of this agreement mean that we can adjust our military planning in a different direction. We have obviously prepared for a full range of contingencies should Iran continue to be in violation, or had they continue to be in violation and move closer to a nuclear weapons capability. That's an area where we will continue to plan for, but it's not as acute as dealing with other Iranian activities, whether it's related to terrorism support, arms shipment. And so we'll continue to focus our efforts on the full suite of contingencies that we need to work on. Secretary Carter is talking about exactly those arrangements in the region now. And you saw with the Gulf Cooperation Council Summit at Camp David, the leaders of the Gulf countries come in to talk about how we now deal with Iran after this agreement. Because we recognize that this agreement doesn't solve all the challenges. We are prepared to do more to work with our allies, but we're also asking our allies to do more themselves. It's not a question of their commitment. They spend a lot more money than Iran. The Iranian defense budget might be $15 billion. It pales in comparison to what the Saudis and the UAE spend. But what we need for them is to use that investment to increase their capabilities to really confront the threats that we see from Iran and Iranian proxies. So that's an effort that's going to go on and will continue to go on. We think it's actually vastly improved over where we were just several years ago, but it's something that we're going to continue to work on very closely.
Yeah. So your question and your answer are the perfect segue to the next panel on regional security implications. So John, thank you so much for joining us. Really very, very enlightening and helpful to have your detailed explanations of the elements of the agreement and how the administration is thinking about it going forward. So again, please join me in thanking John Wolfstoff. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sean.
Yeah, really appreciate it.